My name is Arif. My question is, it's a bit sensitive because we are in Malaysia, but I'll try to frame it in a less sensitive way. Throughout the history of Thailand, we have seen that the king, the late king, has been playing a very strong influence in Thai politics. There has been several royal intervention in politics in 1973, for example. During the student protest in Thammasat University, he allowed the students to protest in the palace ground. And then in 2006, he somehow endorsed the overthrow of Thaksin Shinawatra. Coming to home, Malaysia, and also looking broadly in Southeast Asia, would you think that royal intervention is a form of obstacle to democratic transitions, or rather a good thing? Or
Well, this is as diplomatic as it gets. The Philippines has no monarchy, and maybe that's good. We have somehow solved the problem in the south with the troublesome sultanates, and we've signed a peace agreement, which has been long-standing. Every president has tried to initiate and undertake a peace agreement, and for some reason it always gets stalled, but finally we signed. And so I think we'll have lesser problems with these issues. Number one, because we never had a monarchy, and number two, whatever royalty there was in the south with the sultanates, I would like to think has been resolved. And so perhaps that's my very diplomatic way of saying that in a democratic transition process, it is good to have, in principle, a democratic consensus, no matter how flawed and imperfect, and maybe not even sustainable in the long term, but at least to continue to insist on that democratic process, because the outcomes of those processes, I think, even if they are imperfect, are better, are good ingredients for citizenship, and in the end, I think are more long-lasting and more sustainable.
Well, you could argue that ruling families in the Middle East, who view themselves as royals, are the driving motor behind a counter-revolution. With other words, behind trying to maintain as much of the status quo as they can, or shape the region in their mold. It's not true for all ruling families in the region. Qatar is an autocracy, no less of an autocracy, but maybe more enlightened than either the UAE or Saudi Arabia. But they actually saw political change in the region, not at home, and not necessarily the Gulf itself, at least until recently, but in the rest of the region as their interest. So you have monarchies with two different strategies. I would argue that ultimately, in determining whether or not countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE were going to become these very powerful counter-revolutionary forces, the monarchy is irrelevant. If you had had another type of regime with the type of resources that these countries have, you could have seen a very similar picture.
When we discuss about Middle East, political transition in Middle East, one country tend to escape discussion is Oman. We see 1970s, I think, the overthrow of the former king Said bin Timur, and the rise of power of Qaboos. And during that time as well, Oman isn't exactly a peaceful state. There was a Dhofar rebellion and quite a number of anti-communist unrest as well in some part of the countries. But how was it? Oman, compared to other states in Middle East and North Africa, were able to have a relatively smooth political transition.
I don't think Oman was unique. With other words, if you go back to 2011, and actually since, and not that long ago, you had protests in 2011. You had people thrown into prison. I mean, with other words, it was not the revolt that you saw in Egypt or Tunisia or Libya or Yemen, but it was the kind of protest that you saw in Morocco, in Algeria, in Jordan. So in that sense, I'm not sure that Oman was unique. A lot of the protests were in Salalah, in the south, but they were also in Muscat. You've seen not as brutal as the UAE, or as brutal as the Saudis at times go to work, but you've seen journalists and other civic society figures being sentenced or reprimanded or imprisoned for what periods of time. So I'm not sure that Oman, and again, don't forget that Oman is one of the poorer Gulf states. You know, much like Bahrain, it's not run totally out of oil, but they can see the end of the tunnel, and it's coming very quick. And on top of that, Oman has a succession problem. You know, it's not clear who the successor is, but that's built into the system. But it's not clear who the successor is at a moment that the Sultan is ill.
Now I'm going to ask about a follow-up to the question. So do you think that Oman is going to be next in line, if you like?
No, that's not what I'm arguing. All I'm arguing is, you know, the implication of your question was that Oman was this peaceful, quiet, harmonious place in a world of disintegration. And what I'm saying is, I mean, if you go back to 2011, you can basically throw this into three categories, if you wish. You had the successful revolts initially, no matter what happened afterwards. So the four countries where leaders were overthrown. You had two countries where you had peaceful protests that were deliberately turned into either brutal repression or civil war based on a sectarian approach. So you had in Bahrain, where the initial, as in Syria, the initial demand was not a change of regime, it was a change of policy, and it was greater freedom and greater participation, and that was turned into a sectarian conflict with a Saudi-led military intervention. And you had Syria, where you had the same thing, and more, you know, again with intervention from outside powers and a regime that deliberately turned this into a more sectarian problem. And then you had a host of countries, you know, as I mentioned before, including Oman, that had protests, but where either, for whatever reason, and the reason usually was that there was some degree of enlightened response. You know, Morocco was certainly the case, where the king got in front of the cart instead of running behind the cart, but also in Jordan and Oman, where you had protests, but they did not escalate. You know, and they were widespread protests, but they did not escalate to the point that the regime was really in danger of being toppled, in part because the regime was responsive. And so I'm not predicting that Oman is next. I don't think any of these countries ultimately can be shielded against change. But, you know, your guess is as good as mine which one goes first.
That's where let's bring it back to Southeast Asia, because this is where we are after all. There are a lot of good things that are happening in this region, despite its problems. And there are really serious problems in this region for sure. But two things. One is that we have ASEAN, and it's functioning. My friends at the National University of Singapore would always say, well, ASEAN is 50 meetings a year and they're talking all the time. It's a talk shop. But equally, somebody said from your school, it's good that they're talking and they're talking a lot. Even if there are no really dramatic concrete results come out, because they're not fighting. The battlefields in Southeast Asia are in the boardrooms, in the ASEAN Secretariat, in the summits. They're not in the battlefields of Vietnam in the 1970s or Cambodia or Laos. So let them talk. And if it's 50 meetings a year and they double it, they triple it, even the better. Because that takes them out of trouble. So we have that. We have ASEAN. And more countries are coming into the fold. And you draw them into a regional body and a regional economy. When you're trading electricity and Laos is growing at 8.8% selling electricity to Thailand and to Vietnam, they stop thinking about blowing up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So these are real benefits that we don't appreciate enough. Cambodia is now selling rice. They used to be one of the two most bombed countries in Southeast Asia in the 1970s. So ASEAN, for all, again, its bureaucratic imperfections, is producing what they call the Asian dividend, the Asian peace dividend. And I failed to mention here that Alex Bellamy said that really the most impressive achievement of Asia is this prolonged period of nearly 15 years, half a century of peace. No massacres. Well, actually, we have to take that back.
Can I add one thing?
Sorry. And the second, yes, Ms. Timor, yes, sorry. But I guess, that's why comparative studies are always good rather than single unit analysis, because even in comparison to the Middle East, I think for now we can still say that possibly our region is enjoying some relative peace and prosperity. I mean, per capita incomes here are over $6,000, and distribution of that economic pie in a regional sense is more or less not as severe as you find in the Middle East. So that's one point. The second is that we don't have a backyard of interregional rivalry like what you have among the Saudis and the Iranians. Although that's getting exported here too. Okay, and we have to watch that. But we have a regional response to these problems. I mean, we all know that the IS is in the southern Philippines and they're possibly regrouping. But our governments know that as well. And they are responding. We're working with the Indonesians and we're working with the Malaysians and we're patrolling that border between Sabah and Sulu and Brunei. And that triangle is a dangerous triangle. But there are concerted efforts to address that problem. So I'm not being romantic about the region, but I'm also saying that it's not mayhem. It's not the Middle East. It's not Iraq. It's not Syria. It's not Yemen. We have, I would like to think, a concerted, more or less streamlined response to our regional problems. And that has so far, prevented the region from having a conflagration, the kind of which the Middle East experienced in 2010. And is not, by the way, is not stopping.
I just want to put one caveat on what Tess said. Talking's good, of course.
Yeah.
But, and sure, Cambodia's selling rice to whoever. The fact of the matter is that what it really takes is not just talking. It takes governments or regimes that are willing to find some sort of minimal common denominator and who see conflict, open conflict as too high a price to pay. So look at what happened to the GCC. I mean, Saudi Arabia and the UAE blew it apart. The fact of the matter is that despite the embargo,
So the loss of life doesn't
still every day sells gas to Dubai. Dubai would shut down the moment that gas pipe gets cut off. The gas pipe is owned by Abu Dhabi. They haven't shut it down despite they're the ones being embargoing. So it's not just talking. It takes fundamental attitudes that clearly are existent within ASEAN that are not existent with a comparable regional body.
That the loss of life, that price is too high.
No, I don't think anybody cares about the loss of life.
No.
Sorry to be such a cynic.
No? Okay.
But simply, look, it could be various things. In the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE, it's total miscalculation.
Okay.
They had no realistic assessment of how the Qataris would be able to respond, and they had no realistic assessment of what the international community would respond, which is their problem today. They would have been perfectly willing to sacrifice life if
So what checks would countries like that need then in order for
It's
them to go?
it's a question. I think it's a question, but Tess can answer this too. And you had a question, so I don't want to take time away. But I think it's a question of what serves best their political interest.
Okay, so it comes back to that question.
And so whatever Malaysia is not going to go to war against Singapore, whatever the differences are, because it would rock the boat too much.
That's true.
Whereas the Saudis and the Qataris, the Saudis and the Emiratis would. They don't care about rocking the boat.
Okay.
There were actually three, The third one was Southeast Asia has bright spots. Indonesia. I mean, for all that Indonesia has its problems, Indonesia has had 7 very credible elections, and they will have another one in April. And Indonesia is the biggest country in Southeast Asia. It's also the biggest Muslim democracy in the world. Now that's something, if you think about it. Southeast Asia also has small successes that build up to larger ones. We can showcase something. And again, I go back to Malaysia. I mean, you'd think I was a Malaysian, if you watched me last year, staying up until 3 a.m. listening to Nawab, your colleague at RSIS, as he dissected vote after vote that came in, from the different states. And it was so exhilarating because, wow, this is happening in Malaysia that for the longest time we thought was such an illiberal democracy, to be kind about it. And here you get, a total upset, and you have the wheels of justice, rolling. And this does not stay in a country unnoticed. I am sure the Filipinos were watching this in the Philippines as well. The Thais, it was told, were watching this because they are preparing for elections, and they were talking about a Malaysia example in Thailand in February next year. And there are now these 4 young Thai Democrats who went on television, and they call themselves the Small Democrats, the small D, not the National League of Democracy, the yellow shirts. And they said very simply, what we are is pro-democracy, no military rule, and we want to compete openly and fairly in the marketplace of ideas. Because they saw what happened to Malaysia. So, we imitate each other. For better or for worse, but for better. And as I said, when we live close to each other, and when we talk to each other, but also when we trade with each other, even with our problems, the examples that we show to each other are truly worth emulating. And I'm not sure that you have a shining example in the Middle East, because you have one, Tunisia.
Well, you have a shining example of autocracy that everybody imitates.
They go the other way. They go the other way.
Right.
How real was the transformation in the Philippines and in Indonesia? How real was it? because the same elites, you have your royalty in the Philippines, the same elites are in charge. You could say Malaysia's media had a monopoly. In the Philippines, do you really have a free media in the sense it's controlled by the same elites? These people are still, the corrupt Marcoses are still in Parliament, they're still in Congress. So I'm not sure how real is this. And in Indonesia, the same elites are there. I think there's a very real danger in Indonesia that Prabowo, with the right-wing Islamists, might even get into power in Indonesia. So, and then democracy will turn back. So I'm also interested in your sort of analysis. And in Malaysia, Mahathir seems to be backtracking on a lot of things, taking all these corrupt UMNO people back in. I mean, so this the power of the power structures, the elite structures. Even though you might get rid of the military, you're not really changing the structures. And in Egypt, this is the same thing. The military controls 80% of the economy. They were never going to give that up. So, so I think transition means much more, I think, than, I'm asking you really, doesn't it mean much more than just from army rule to civilian rule? Doesn't it mean much more than that? That's my question really. And in the Philippines, for example, the very peace treaty that you talked about is being challenged by the elite. Do they really want peace in the south? It's the poorest region of the country. There seems to be the willingness of some of the elite for compromise, but others don't want that compromise, and it was stymied once. I mean, Marcos tricked Miswari in the Tripoli Agreement, because Miswari gave up everything, and then Marcos, with his legal mind, put that according to the constitution there. He knew that it wouldn't work, but as a military dictator, he could have done it. So my concern is, will the peace hold? But these power structures, the elites, they're still in control, and they're not going to change easily, either in the Middle East. Yes, Southeast Asia is a much brighter spot than the Middle East, but
guilty as charged. and sure, you raise the really, really tough questions, not just about the Philippines, but Indonesia and now Malaysia and Myanmar. I mean, God, look at Myanmar and this bright Aung San Suu Kyi now getting disenfranchised and stripped of her awards. One way of looking at this is it's despairing and it's desperate. Sure, I will grant you that. When we wrote this book, it was August 2016, so Duterte had just come to power, and look where we are now. James always says this, he always has this expression, glass is half full or glass is half empty. You, sir, are rightfully looking at this with all the hard evidence of a glass half empty. For sure. And I grant you that. What I think I'm saying is, but there's the half full part. And I'd like to look at that. I think it is also quite simplistic to say that all the Marcos elites are back in power. Well, not quite. Not quite. We have new elites. And maybe some of them are not going to behave in the same way. That some of them are going to have more enlightened decision making. That some of them will have the greater public good in mind. Even our military, by the way. There has been temptations to undertake another military adventure, but they have resisted. Because they do espouse the principle of civilian supremacy. And that's quite surprising. And so you don't see them reinserting themselves in the political arena in the same way that they were during the Marcos era. So there has been a transformation in the military that has endured. Second, the media, okay, yes, they are still owned by some oligarchs, but Journalist of the Year, according to Time, is an independent woman journalist who won that award for speaking truth to power. And that's not an oligarchic newspaper. So we have that. On balance, I think we have a struggle of forces now in which there is real competition for those values that you talked about. And yes, there are elements of the old regime that perpetuate themselves, as you see in Indonesia, the old oligarchy. But you also see new enlightened elites that have entered into the political arena. You have seen civil society enduring despite setbacks. We have support from the international community, thank God. We have Time, who named Maria Ressa as Journalist of the Year, and that counts for something. And again, I say we have our neighbors. We have the Indonesians, we have the Malaysians, we have the Singaporeans, and we are, I think, as a region, upholding the principles of regional cooperation. However flawed and all the holes, in ASEAN. And I think this acts as brakes to each other so that our problems don't go out of control. I think interestingly, at the height of the Rohingya problem, the Malaysians and the Singaporeans and the Filipinos were talking quietly and trying to solve this problem so that it doesn't start to look like the Middle East. And I'm not going to project or to forecast what is going to happen or not going to happen with the Rohingya problem. I won't, because that's dangerous. But I will dare say that whether we talk about it openly in ASEAN or whether we talk about it quietly among our leaders, there are attempts to collectively solve this problem. And that and even within Myanmar themselves, within Myanmar itself, are civil society groups who are against this.
No, even
this
the
problem.
army. When you meet the army, some of the army, they acknowledge that we don't know what's going on.
Can you speak louder?
Some of the army in Myanmar will admit that this is bad for us, but they're part of the system and they can't really do it. But the other point about Middle East, I would say, how much role has the West played in the dictatorships and the military power of the Middle East? How much role has Western power played in the dilemma? And I recently attended a launch of a book called Sectarianization of the Middle East at the Chatham House. And basically it's pointing out that this sectarianization is a fairly recent phenomenon. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, Sunni and Shia used to intermarry. They didn't really, it was not this. But this sectarianization now has been used for political purposes, and it's going to take a long time to recover. But just to add my question about the role of the West in the dilemmas that are facing civil society and democracy in the Middle East.
Yes, I think both of you have not mentioned geopolitics at all, because I think it's a very important factor when we're talking about this issue of democratization.
Yeah.
Because if you see that, the fall of Morsi in Egypt, for example, I think US and Saudi Arabia played very important role in bringing down Morsi. So we cannot take out that from the equation, and I guess we have to address it. So
I would actually disagree with you on that.
Okay.
Let me break the answer into three parts. Just very briefly on the point that you said about Egypt.
We'll be 5 minutes left. I suspect already that we're already getting material. Can we go over? But also as well, I suspect that you're going to be invited once again in 2019.
I was afraid of that.
You're afraid of that. Okay, sorry.
But let me break it into three parts, just very briefly about Egypt.
Go.
The military's economic stake, or a stake in the economy, was always part of the bargain.
Sorry?
That was always part of the bargain.
Yeah.
So where I spoke earlier about regimes buying off the military, there were 4 points in Egypt. One of them was the military. It was with the economy. However, while the military was a major player in the economy, it's only with the military coup in 2013 that its stake in the economy vastly expanded. It was big, but it vastly expanded. And that was both partly Sisi's doing, and it was the way that contracts primarily by the UAE and Saudi Arabia were awarded. So that's, you know, that whatever the percentage is, and it's more than 50% at this point, granted, that really is the last few years. The second point I want to make, which is more about what you were saying about the oligarchs, which I agree with, but to be honest, it's very easy for you and me to sit here on a couch and say that. As a matter of principle, you look at the process from the moment you get protests through the overthrow, through the first government and the subsequent governments, and it's exactly what Tess described very graphically. It's compromise. It's a compromise and an alliance of the groups that hit the street. It's a compromise at the end when you have the overthrow. It's a compromise down the road.
Yeah.
And so, you know, your first success is a change of government.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, liberalization. It's not change of social and political or economic power structures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, the elites
That's true.
are not necessarily homogeneous. You know, you're again talking about countering efforts. So that's what I mean when I say it's easy for you and me to sit here and come to that conclusion, and I agree with the conclusion. The practice, and you know, Tess can speak to that much better than I can, but the practice is a lot more hard-nosed. And if you know, if my analysis is correct, that we're in the case of of Southeast Asia, roughly at the halfway point, we got another halfway to go.
Yeah.
In which probably those are the kind of issues that are going to start to be tackled.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So that's, on your point, I do disagree fundamentally. And the reason I disagree with is this. The West is guilty in the sense, and I think if you made an economic argument, you would come to another conclusion. The West simply, and that's what I was trying to describe in what I was saying, the West opted for stability, not for change. And it saw stability in the existing regimes.
But they tried to change Syrian regime.
Hold on. Let me just finish the thought, okay? That did not mean, and particularly in the Cold War period, that the West did not collaborate quite a lot with Islamists. And the Afghan war, you know, the jihad against the Soviets is just the pinnacle of it. There was cooperation throughout, including with the Brotherhood. It's only, I mean, and the West always was uneasy with Islamists. I mean, it was not that they, you know, embraced them, and then with the rise of jihadism and political violence, they suddenly changed their minds. It was always an uneasy, but there was continued support. To the extent, by the way, that I think it's 3 years ago, the United States, the government gave $65 million to the University of Nebraska to rewrite Afghan school textbooks. Why did they do it? Because the school book textbooks that they'd given before all had jihadist concepts in them because it was the jihad against the Soviets. So it's a much more, and again, for Saudi Arabia, the same thing. The anti-brotherhood stance of Saudi Arabia and a stance against political Islam is skin deep. The real driver in this is Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE. And in fact, if you go look at the first few months of the Salmans, so when King Salman came to power, there was an opening to the Brotherhood. Saud al-Faisal, who was still alive and foreign minister, then came out and said, we have no problem with the Brotherhood. You had a meeting in Mecca in a building of the World Muslim League, which was basically run by the Brotherhood, that hadn't been used. A Saudi front, but it was run by the Brotherhood. So trust me, I know this. I know this. No, it was run by the Brotherhood. It was funded by the Wahhabis. It's a whole discussion that we can get into,
We can do
which
that
I'm not going to do now.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book on it, actually.
Oh.
But the point is I'm trying to make is, it was a building that was not used. But you had a number of brothers invited from Doha to go to that meeting, and a number of galleries very close to that. And if there was a statement, which I forget what it was, by Mohammed bin Salman. If you go back to the overthrow, when Morsi won the election, the Americans wanted, the push by the Americans at that moment was for the legitimacy of the election to be accepted. And Patterson was at the time the US ambassador in Cairo. She was demonized in the Egyptian media.
She was what?
Demonized in the Egyptian media. And sure, you had the role of Frank Wisner and what have you, but fundamentally the Americans at that point were willing to accept the legitimacy of the election. And they pushed to the last minute to try and stop the coup. Now, the Saudis was a different picture. The Saudis and the UAE were funding this thing all the way through. They wanted the overthrow of Morsi at whatever cost. And it was a divergence of Saudi-US interests, which is part of what drove Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states, for that matter, to become much more assertive, because the U.S. that was one of the reasons why the U.S. had no longer become a fully reliable partner of the Gulf, for that very reason.
Final thought is very thankful and grateful and happy to be here, and thank you for being so gracious and for the invitation. And I'm glad that you asked that question, Farouk, because actually we're thinking of what next after this book, given the changes that have happened since its publication. And you're right that we missed in this book, what we looked at in this book were the internal factors, the military, civil society, etc. We didn't look at the geopolitical environment. And in the end, Marcos left because Reagan sent 2 helicopters. So in the end, maybe it was Americans who really ditched him. Maybe. Same with Suharto. Right. So the whole geopolitical environment was not tackled in this book. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, was in Indonesia, in Myanmar, working underground. The European NGOs were in the Philippines. So there's that whole geopolitical relationship that has a direct bearing on political transitions that we had not discussed. And we want to look into it, and you gave us the reason to write that sequel. And I would like to say also that, again, going back to our region, that in the end geopolitics might play a role, and does play a role. But I'm sorry, you know, I'm so upbeat on Southeast Asians and the way we can, despite us being a background and a playground of these big powers, that we have managed quite well, which leaves much to be desired for the Middle East. And that's the note that I want to end on. Thank you.
Well, I traditionally second anything that Tess says.
Of course, of course.
But having said that, I want to throw one thought out, which I really haven't quite decided in my mind. I'm someone who looks very keenly at geopolitics.
Yeah.
The question, and for the longest period of time, it was geopolitics that defined in the Middle East. And that time was primarily the Cold War. Now, the question for me is is it the dog wagging the tail, or is it the tail wagging the dog? So, with other words, is it regime survival that is is it geopolitics that is driving what is happening in the Middle East, or is it regime survival strategies, whatever one may think of them, that is creating geopolitical opportunities for various different players? And I would argue it's the second. So with other words, America withdrawing from Syria creates geopolitical opportunity for the Russians, for the whatever, it's not geopolitics that defined the American withdrawal from Syria. The battles, the assertiveness of the Gulf states that is creating, again, opportunity for various powers are extensions of regime survival. They're not responses to geopolitics as such.
I just want to know what's your opinion if I were to say that, the American interest in the Middle East was purely for the benefit of the Zionist regime of Israel?
I think it's too simplistic, frankly. First of all, look, fact of the matter is, let me say it differently. In fact, you have various lobbies. And the oil lobby in the United States is a very powerful lobby. And that was not an Israeli lobby. It was not a Jewish lobby. It was not a Zionist lobby. What I think that you have is that the fact of the matter is, the Americans always said about the Saudis, for example, which was one of their closest allies, we do not share values. We have nothing in common. We share interests. The fact of the matter is that America with Israel shared values for the longest period of time. On top of which, foreign policy is always an extension of domestic policy. The fact of the matter is that the rise of the evangelist community, Jews are in that sense irrelevant. Jews are 6 million in the U.S. Let's say 4 million vote. Evangelists are 100 million. And they had close ties to Israel. The third thing is politics in democracies, but certainly in Washington, are shaped by lobbying groups. The Israelis were brilliant lobbyists. The Arabs could not get their act together. It's only very recently that they could get their act together. So the Israelis were kicking into an open goal. So I think it's too simplistic to say that, and sure, it's probably far more true in a lot of ways today with Trump and whatever. But prior to Trump, I think it's far too simplistic to put that, that relationship is much more dynamic. And look, Obama's relationships with Netanyahu were abominable for the very reason that Obama tried and failed to confront Israeli policy. And which is why Netanyahu, deliberately went out of his way to try and support Trump.
What do you say when the U.S. decided to move the embassy to Western Syria?
Look, I think that Trump fundamentally altered U.S. policy. So I'm not saying that U.S. policy before that was anti-Israel. Israel was always a cornerstone of Israel policy. But there was a difference in between what the Americans defined as their interests and what they defined as Israeli interests. That gap in definition of interest has vanished. And fundamentally, U.S. policy today is a policy that the Israelis would embrace wholeheartedly. It's exactly what they want. But this is 2 years old. This is not, and again, I'm not saying that there was fundamentally an anti-Israeli policy before that. There wasn't. On the contrary, absolutely. But this absolute marriage of interests is new and unprecedented. And I think, is going to fail, ultimately.
Has arrived now, so I know it would be very un-Malaysian of me to let this conversation continue
Without food.
Without the food. So I just want to say, and as you can see, the conversation, whether we all agree or disagree with what's been shared here today in the reading session, there's one thing that became very clear to me, and that is that the conversation has been informative, it has been enlightening, it has sparked debate, and this is one of the aims of IRF, which is that we want to encourage people who think. And so this is the essence of what you have seen here today. But before we go, I just want to say, I know we've already got an exclusive about what the next book's going to be about, but where can people get a hold of the current book?
Where's
the best place?
Yes, we will contact our publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, because we get an author's discount. I'm not sure if it's 10 or 40%. But we will contact, and she's in Shanghai, in the Palgrave Macmillan office there, to make available to you books at a discounted price, and let us know how many, and I will make sure that I'll contact Sarah. She's waiting for the proposal for the next one, in fact. So it's a good reason for me to contact her and make available to you the discounted price. Okay. And thank you if you're going to buy it.
Fantastic. Who doesn't love a good bargain? And what's coming up for you guys for 2019? Where are you going to be speaking? Those audience members that have joined us both physically and obviously online as well, where can they see you next?
Around the globe.
I'll be both in Singapore and in Berlin. I've just recently been appointed Director of Research and Policy for a think tank called Dialogue of Civilizations, and so this is so in Berlin, but it's a dialogue of civilizations. So coming here was like my first event in this global dialogue, and it is truly the kind of thing that we also would like to do and encourage. And I will give you our contact details and inform you of our activities, and maybe even explore things that we can do together. Yeah, for sure. And Arif, I still want you to go to graduate school. Thank you for coming.
Well,
Yes.
you both know that this is not. This may be the first time, but it's definitely not going to be the last time that you will be invited here.
And next time we won't read from a prepared text. We will do storytelling. And yes.
Well, it was
Now
a
that you
different
know the
format than
Yes.
we had expected. But
Yes.
no, it was perfect.
It was perfect.
No, it was perfect, but it was a different
Yes.
format than we expected a little bit.
Yes.
We're always up to exploring different formats.
Yes,
So just
yes.
on behalf of the IRF, I want to thank you all who have participated today for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you all once again in 2019. So wishing you all a very prosperous and joyous festive season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for the moderator.